Good afternoon, friends. Welcome. I know we have friends watching online as well. We're glad that you're here. And I'm grateful for this time and this conversation. Word of introduction for Stephanie. I know a lot of people know Stephanie, but it's important that you hear her background. Since joining Plaza Community Chapel in 2002, Stephanie has held many roles within the organization. In 2021, she became the Executive Vice President of Communal Partnerships. Prior to that, Stephanie was Chief Administrative Officer for 6 years after having served as Director of Community Relations for 12 years. You have a lot of hats.
I know.
A lot of different hats.
Yeah.
Do you get to keep the hats?
I have the hats. Yeah.
Originally from the Midwest, Kansas City Chiefs fan, hardcore. So if there's any fellow fans, no.
What can I say?
Okay.
New Yorkers.
Stephanie has always been involved in the Jewish community. Even during the 25 years she was an actor, appearing in over 1,500 commercials. You can give us some of the brands later. For 12 years she was a member of the North American Palmolive? No, wait.
Sudafed was big, yeah. American Express.
Okay.
Well, please, AT&T, we can go on.
For 12 years, she was a member of the North American Board of the Union for Reform Judaism. For 2 years, she was a member of the Oversight Committee. Currently, she's Vice President of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York and a board member of the Hadassah Foundation. She's also the host of the newly launched podcast Exit Strategy, and has been published regularly in E-Jewish Philanthropy and Times of Israel. And Stephanie's been married to Art Tatke for 43 years, and they're members of the congregation, and they are friends, and in lots of ways. Stephanie is one of the reasons why I'm here at Shaaray Tefila. I'm grateful that you're here, grateful for the work that you do for the Jewish people, for the Reform movement, and the support you give our congregation. So can we welcome Stephanie, Garry?
Please,
it's her congregation, but we're
gosh.
welcoming her to this space.
Thank you. And I do have to add that the podcast Exit Strategy is a monthly podcast, and the title was determined because of the content. We all need an exit strategy. I'm really happy that you are going to be on the podcast. I believe next week we're airing your episode.
Exactly.
So there are cards in the back if you want to take it with you, so you can make sure that you subscribe or tune in, because it's a really interesting conversation for sure.
Absolutely.
Yep.
All the conversations that you've had with the different people that you've had so far have been great.
Yep.
Thank you for taking this time. Can you say a little bit about how you got into the work of, how do people respond when you say, oh, I work in a funeral chapel? And how did you get into that?
For sure, it's probably, and Art knows this, I'm the most popular person at a cocktail party, because everybody is so intrigued by somebody who works in a funeral chapel, let alone someone like me, because I am not a licensed funeral director. I had the privilege and just, out of the blue, phone call one day in 2002 from the chairman of the board of Plaza at that time. As you mentioned, I made my living as an actor for a couple of decades, and my unions went on strike in the year 2000, SAG and AFTRA. And I found myself on a picket line for 6 months, and having been very involved in the Jewish community, I received a phone call from this philanthropist. And he said, "You're an actor and an activist. I've got a great gig for you." And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. What would that be?" And he said, "So, I've got this funeral chapel on the Upper West Side of Manhattan." And I was like, "You don't know me, but I'm not funeral chapel material." And he said, "No, I want to talk to you." And after meeting with him for 2 hours, he said, "Do me a favor, go to the chapel and tell me what you think." So I went to the chapel, and growing up in the Midwest in Kansas City, I knew absolutely nothing about traditional Jewish burial. I did not know what a tahara was. I didn't know what a shomer was. And I walk in for my appointment at this funeral chapel, and to my left is a small chapel, and inside was a shomer, a watcher, who was chanting psalms before a service began. And the casket was laid out, and there was a candle burning at the head of the casket, which is where it always burns. And I had a moment. I knew I was in sacred space. I knew that what goes on here must be incredibly important to the families. And I was looking for work, and I went home and I said to Art, I don't know. I found this funeral chapel through this philanthropist, and I don't know, I think it's really special. And lo and behold, it has been an incredible honor for me to be there for people in a moment when we're always looking towards how we can help someone in that moment. And we know that when somebody dies, it has probably the most profound effect on our lives. And to know that I can be there in that moment to guide people is an incredible honor. And that's a long-winded answer for how I got to Plaza.
No, it's a great answer. Should we ask Art what his reaction was when you told him what you mean?
Well, my original reaction.
Actually, you know what? I actually want, people are online, so Art, if you're I'm curious to hear what you'd said.
My original reaction was when she went to meet the chairman of the board. I said, where are you meeting him? She said, in his apartment. And I thought, really? Really? And then when she came home that night and she told me about the chapel and how she felt about it, I said, honey, if that's what you want to do, then that's what you should do. But I will say this, it has been such a blessing, not just for our family, but for our friends in their times of trouble. But for us, death is a thing that we're well aware of. Every day we're aware of it. And because of that, we live our lives, I think, with a different perspective.
Nice.
So thank you, Steph, for doing that.
Thanks for supporting her and doing it. So you and I have talked about lots of things, and Stephanie was one of my readers for my sermon today, so thank you for that. In your experience, why, I mean, this might be obvious, I suppose, but everybody has different reasons. Why do you think it's so hard for people to talk about about end-of-life things, about end-of-life topics, about what they want in terms of their care, what they want in terms of once they die? Why is it a hard topic, do you think?
It is. It is. And I think a couple of reasons. And again, I have learned these things through my 20 plus years of working at a funeral chapel. I am not a professional in any way other than really a professional observer and listener. But we as a culture, we don't like to talk about death because we're so focused on living. And I think that's because we're trying, we're trying to avoid death. So we live hard. We as Jews, and you and I have talked about this, we don't embrace this conversation. And I have to tell you, your sermon touched me so much, and I'm so appreciative of the fact that here before thousands of people, you brought this conversation to the present, because it is one of the most, if not the most important conversation that we can have with our family members or friends, and we avoid it. And we avoid it because that's our way of keeping it away. And guess what? I'm here to tell you that One of the things I've learned in my 21 years is that everybody has a date on the calendar, and we don't know when it's going to be. I have heard far too many stories about the healthy 42-year-old who just ran a marathon who had a brain aneurysm in the shower. I wonder if he had had a conversation with anybody prior to that tragic day. So I think we try to keep it at bay so we don't talk about it. And yet we know that once we talk about it, we feel so much better. We've talked about it, we've made our arrangements. Art and I have made our arrangements because we have a 37-year-old son, and the last thing we want to do is leave that burden on his shoulders. And I have to tell you, it happens all the time. When people do not have the conversations, somebody dies, and young adults or partners or whomever have to deal with these incredibly emotional conversations at a time when they are completely distraught. So I think that we don't talk about it because we hope it goes away. And in Judaism, and you and I have talked about this, is that, as we know, the Kaddish is at the end of the service. The Kaddish is brief and quick. We mention those who came before us, which is, for sure, one of the most beautiful things we do. Yet, we say the Kaddish and we're done. Would be really remarkable if we started a service with the Kaddish.
Why do you think?
What would that say? That would say that those who have died are with us right here, right now, for the duration of the service, as opposed to a thought at the end.
So interesting.
It would set a tone for how we feel about end-of-life conversation, that it's in front of us, and we lead with that. Again, and Art can tell you, I'm not Debbie Downer to live with. I don't, even though I talk about death and it's in my world, I'm an incredibly upbeat, positive person. Yet, I'm very aware of the powerful message that end of life has in all of our lives. So I think we as Jews, and I've talked about this with a number of clergy, I'm so blessed to know a number of clergy, that it's something we need to really talk about. And again, I'm so happy that you did that today.
Thank you.
In such a personal way, by the way.
Thank you. So you've touched on this already, but I'm wondering, and every situation is different and every family is different. But I'm wondering if you can sort of paint two pictures for us. One is a picture of what it looks like when families don't have these conversations before the person has died. And what does it look like? Again, like you're painting with broad strokes. Every situation is different, but what does it look like when families do have these conversations, or when people do make decisions before they die?
Yep. I will tell you, because I'm the one who works in end of life, I'm responsible for, it seems I'm responsible for funerals in my family. So when my dad...
That's funny, I'm responsible for funerals in my family too. So.
Look at that, that beautiful responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
So I will tell you, my dad of blessed memory, and it was beautiful to see his name today in the book. He died 15 years ago. I was working, of course, in this world. I was in charge of his funeral arrangements in Kansas City. And Art and I were with him the day he died. And what an incredibly beautiful gift that was. I know exactly what happens when somebody dies. I know what you have to do. I know the arrangements you have to make. And here I am in that moment with my dad when he took his last breath, and I was off my axis a bit. Because I totally believe that when a heart stops beating of somebody in our world, our personal world, our energy shifts. I believe it's a really physical experience that one has. And yet here I was responsible for his funeral arrangements. Fortunately, I had made them all in advance. And I'm so thankful that I did, because that day, when I was by his side and his heart stopped beating, I was in that space that so many of us are in when somebody dies. I was just like everybody else. Yet, arrangements were made. For the people who come to us, and there are many, and they are in that place and they haven't thought about where somebody's going to be buried, what kind of service they want, social security numbers, next of kin, how many death certificates, on and on and on, all the details that need to be thought about, let alone difference of opinion in families. Mom said she wanted this. No, she didn't. Mom said she wanted that. No, she didn't. And it becomes something other than what that moment can and should be about, which is reflecting on the loss that somebody has just had. So things tend to be chaotic and challenging for those who are going through a highly emotional experience, as opposed to being a bit smoother, letting those who have experienced loss really experience what that moment feels like. And the beautiful thing that happens is how people gather around and support people through that time. If one is just so consumed with making decisions and thinking about, does Dad want to have military honors and I've got to get the honorable discharge papers to the, it becomes very detailed oriented.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. Yeah. I posed a few questions in my sermon that I wanted to encourage people to begin to think about. I'm wondering, if you could say 3 or 4 things that you think would serve people so importantly to think about for themselves, think about with their loved ones before death happens. What would you say are some of the most important questions people should be thinking about?
Sure. So I will tell you that a dear friend of mine died yesterday.
Sorry.
And he received a diagnosis 4 weeks ago.
Wow.
4 weeks ago. His wife said to me, I don't know where to begin. And I thought to myself, if only they had had this conversation when they didn't have to have it. So the one thing I'm going to tell you, number one, is when we don't have to have the conversation, which is, okay, and Art and I have had this, so I can share. All right, where are we going to be buried? What is our service going to look like? And put pen to paper, make a file, and it's done. So my number one suggestion is have this conversation before you have to have it. Because once that diagnosis comes in, the headset is all about Let's focus on getting better. Let's focus on getting through the treatments. The last thing you want to do is talk about funeral arrangements when you're trying to be positive and optimistic and moving forward. And then when you talk about funeral arrangements in that time, you're not in the place that you might have been if you had talked about it when you didn't have to. So that's number one. I think you need to talk about this in multi-generational ways, with multi-generations in front of you, if possible. It's a very different conversation when grandchildren are sitting with grandparents and children talking about this. It also lets everybody know that this is a conversation that we're going to have, and it's okay. I will tell you, back in the day, when families lived together, grandparents lived in the same house as the kids, the grandchildren saw grandparents get old and sick. They were around the bed when they died. Today, you know, we're off to hospice. Today, we're off to nursing homes. We're off to other places. So young people don't experience what they possibly can to make them feel a bit more at ease. So if it can be a multi-generational conversation, I think that's important. But one needs to think about, where am I going to be buried? What is that going to look like? And where is it going to take place? General questions.
It's important to pick a funeral home, too.
It's important to do your homework and pick a funeral home.
Yes.
Thank you for saying that.
I'm on the board of Plaza Community Chapel, so I need to be, fully transparent. There are lots of amazing funeral homes here in the city. But in my experience, when people know who that first call is, the funeral home already knows where the burial is going to be, what casket, all those, because those conversations have taken place in a different kind of way, and then they can make, so people will call me and say, when the time comes, Rabbi, what should I do? And I said, well, first call should be to the funeral home, and then maybe the second call is to the synagogue. And so I feel like funeral homes are very good at helping people have those conversations and think through the list of all the things, the decisions they'll need to make so that they can make them in
Absolutely,
advance.
and I do believe that your funeral directors are your guides to get you through this process. And I believe, as you said, doing homework and finding out which funeral chapel speaks to you, I think is a really important thing to do, for sure.
Yeah. I want to leave some time for people here to ask questions. Would you be willing to share with me what your mom shared with you about what she wants
My mom,
when
absolutely.
she dies?
She would be so happy. I'm sorry she doesn't have the capacity to Zoom. She'd be so happy to know that she was the topic of a conversation on Yom Kippur Day. My mom's the past president of her synagogue in Kansas City, and this would make her so happy. I will tell her this. So my mom turned 97 on last week. And I will
Please
tell
send her
you,
our happy birthdays.
Thank you. I will. And I will tell you that when she was 82, I sat down with her and I talked to her about her funeral. And I said, I work in a funeral chapel. I got to know, what are your wishes? And she was so happy to talk about it. So she wants to have the funeral in the synagogue where she's a past president. Of course she does. She said, the number one reason I want that is because of the glass in the sanctuary, and I always loved watching the seasons change.
Beautiful.
Number two, I want to make sure that you play a song by Debbie Friedman, Lech Lecha. I said, okay. Okay. And she said, I only want the rabbi to speak. The rabbi she's very close to. I said, really? She said, well, I actually want one other thing. I said, okay. And she said, I want like a spray of yellow roses on my casket. I said, Mom, you know, we don't really do flowers. And she said, but that's what I want. And I said, but that's like a racehorse. You don't want, she says, I want yellow roses on my casket. Today, she wouldn't be able to tell me a thing. And she's given me a great gift. Because when she dies, and I believe she's going to live a long time, I can give her something that was so important to her. And what a gift that is to me. So while these conversations are so important for us to do, they're just as important for our son to have. And he knows that there's a file, he knows what to do, and he of course says, I don't want to talk about that, I don't want to talk about that. And yet, he'll be so happy to know, oh wow, that's what they wanted.
Really helpful. Well, may she live to be 120.
I think she will.
For sure.
I think she will.
I'm curious what questions are emerging for you, either out of the sermon or out of what Stephanie has shared. What's percolating for you that you might want to ask? And I'm going to carry the mic around because we have lots of people watching online, and I want to make sure that we have a chance for those folks to hear too.
Thank you, Stephanie. Good to see you. My question is, you've talked a lot about the process, the stuff, but you haven't talked about the emotional content that goes with the whole process. So could you address that?
So I will tell you again, as an observer, no matter what the age, when someone dies who we are so close to, it has a way of defining our lives. I didn't tell my husband I was going to mention this, but I will. He was 5 years old when his father died, and it has defined his life. I have seen people who lose a parent at the age of 70 who are unable to cope with that loss. And I think a piece of that has to do with the fact that we don't talk about the fact that we're all going to die and it's going to happen. So I'm really pleased to say that Plaza has bereavement support services that we sponsor. We have groups that we sponsor because the reality is when somebody dies, it's incredibly hard sometimes. And we don't get over it in a certain time period. I don't believe we ever have closure. I believe that we find ways to navigate the path. And some days that path is rocky and filled with curves, and other days it's kind of a straight path. But I definitely believe that there is real, serious grief that people experience that they need support in navigating, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Vicki.
Hi, I have a very pragmatic question. First of all, though, I want to thank you for being here and thank the rabbi, and your sermon was wonderful and prompted us to have a conversation when we got home.
Oh my gosh.
So first the conversation is between my husband and I, and then the conversation is with the children. I have no grandchildren. The pragmatic question is, how do you get the children together to meet with you to discuss this? Because their reaction is going to be, oh, we don't have to discuss it now, this is uncomfortable, whatever. What do you suggest as a way of sort of having that conversation?
Really good question.
So I really believe that as adults and as parents, we have the right to say, this is a conversation I want us to have. Mm-hmm. I'm not looking necessarily for your opinion. You owe me the honor of the conversation.
Wow.
And what's remarkable, and I've heard this so many times with families and different dynamics, but what's so remarkable is at the end of the conversation, the kids are so grateful that they had it. So I really think, we have the right and the ability to say, this is something that's that important to me, and I need to have you over. And by the way, I'm all about a cocktail. You want to have a drink and talk about this? Whatever you want, a cappuccino, or you want chamomile tea, whatever it is, works for me. Mm-hmm. But it's an important conversation to have. And as I said, ultimately, people really view this as an incredible gift.
I really like the way you framed that. The Ten Commandments talk about honoring our parents, and there's all kinds of nuances of what that means. And people say, sometimes relationships are complicated with their parents, and what does it mean to honor your parents in those circumstances? But the idea of framing it as, this is part of what it means to honor me as your parent, is that I want to have those conversations. But that takes a level of courage on our part as well, because we don't always have those conversations even with our partner. And so then to say to our kids, I want to talk to you about a thing that might be hard can be difficult, but I really appreciate the way you framed that. For sure. Yeah. We'll just work our way backwards. Yeah, Julie.
Well, Stephanie's going to recognize this because she was my guide through a difficult conversation with my dad, who wanted to be cremated. And I kept on saying, but it's against Jewish law. You call it a conversation, but in actuality, what happens when there's disagreements? In the end, this ties in with what you just said, our decision was made that that's part of honoring our parents, to honor their wishes. And I just couldn't resist telling that story, because sometimes there's difficult choices. It's not just listening to, this is what mom or dad wants, or this is what your husband wants. It might be something that is not what you want, and you have to actually live with the repercussions. So I don't know if you want to comment on that a little.
And then I have a thought about it too, but I want to hear what Stephanie has to say first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I, of course, remember that conversation so well. But the truth is, how wonderful it was that you had that conversation and you knew what that was going to be about, as opposed to having to deal with this once he died and other people chiming in, no, he wanted this, he wanted that, he wanted... That's a huge gift. Whether or not we believe in what this answer is, again, I will just tell you, my brother and his wife, who are out in Arizona, they are having the conversation. They're both not exactly, on the same page with what they want. And yet they're having the conversation, which is the most important thing. So I think that's really important.
I was just going to say, and it's a very interesting, there's, within the Reform movement, there's something called the Responsa Committee, which is a group of Reform rabbis, I was on the Responsa Committee for a while, that respond to questions that people write in, like, my parent has told me that they want to be cremated and I don't want to do that. It's not part of my practice. I want to bury them in a cemetery and be able to visit them. And can I contradict their wishes? What does it mean to honor your parents? Do I have to honor their wishes? And the back and forth, the Responsa Committee was very interesting, but ultimately the answer was, ultimately you have to decide whether or not you want to honor their wishes. But unless you talk to them about it, you definitely have to do what they say. If you don't say, look, I know this is what you want, let me tell you why it would be important to be able to visit you in a place, or why I don't want to do that. The responsive committee said, if you're not willing to have the conversation, you definitely have to do what they tell you. If you have the conversation, then you might be in a better place to be able to say, look, I know this is what my parent wanted. I told them that I didn't want to do that. It's important to me. I'm the person who's still left behind. So having had the conversation, I'm going to honor whatever I can of their wishes, and I'm also going to make room for myself and what I need. So that can be complicated, but I don't know. What does that sound like to you? Is that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, it's like me making sure that there are yellow roses on my mom's casket.
Right.
But yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's take a few more questions. Yeah, please. Thank you, my friend. Judy.
Thank you. I have a 97-year-old mother who's about to be 98. She's all there. I have attempted to have this conversation for a number of years now. I've put it in terms of, Mom, I want to do what you'd want. I really, please tell me what you want. The answer I always get is, I'll be dead. It doesn't matter. Whatever you do is fine. I won't be there, et cetera, et cetera. So I have not found a way in here, because no matter how I frame it, that's basically the answer I get. You may have some better ideas.
I know. I've heard that so many times. Of course, I have, right? And the good news is that you've been with your mom for, 60 of those 98 years, and you know what she would want in terms of where family may be buried, where parents may be buried, a spouse may be buried, and sort of follow that track. And in your gut what would make sense for her. There are those who were raised in very, very traditional homes, came from parents who had kosher homes, who went to Orthodox shuls. Is that something that should be honored in their death? And I think, those things, it really allows us to reflect on our past and where these crazy special people come from. My mom's one of those. And I think it's a real time of reflection, thinking about what would make sense for her. So I don't have the answer. Sorry, I don't. But I think thinking back on the history of the family and what makes sense for them might be of help.
And look, I would say you've asked her. She's made it clear in a way. She's saying, I hear her saying, it's not important to me. You make the decision. So I don't know if that feels liberating or more onerous, because you wish she would just say, this is what I want. But, yeah.
That's right.
Right.
That's correct. That's
Judy
right.
said if it's mostly about if she feels like if she doesn't talk about it, she won't die. There was something else I was thinking about when you were talking, but I'm going to throw it to Bob, who I know was waiting. And we have lots of questions, which is good. This can continue beyond today.
I think you kind of answered the question already, which was, how do you balance the wishes of the parents with the comfort and discomfort of the kids that they're talking to? And I think you kind of answered that. I just wanted to mention, my mother and my father, both parents, made it very clear they wanted graveside funeral. They did not want a rabbi. You do it. And so that's just a little anecdote. So, after my dad died, I went to my rabbi at the time, and I said, my father died. He said, well, where is it and what time? I said, well, they actually don't want you. So what do I do? And so we had already gone to a funeral home. Everything else was arranged. They had the plots, everything else. And he went and he took the rabbi's manual to the copy machine, and he copied it off, and he said, here you go. Just follow the directions. And that was okay.
Well, and you have a beautiful voice. So
Well, I don't know about that, but it worked, and we were able to. Fortunately, my brothers and I felt comfortable with that, and it was what my parents wanted. But getting that, compromise between what what your parents want and what the kids feel comfortable with, I think, can be a challenge at times.
Yeah. Carol, yeah. And then Steve will be next, and then we'll go over to Joanne.
Thank you. Today's sermon was perfect to open this conversation with my sisters, my mother, and her grandchildren. I'm wondering, Rabbi, will this conversation be available for us to share as well?
Yes, we're recording it, and we'll be able to share it. And I want us to be able to create other forums to have this and other conversations, because it's an ongoing one, and I'm glad it was helpful. Steve, and then Joanne,
Okay.
And I might have been missing people over on this side.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for coming and talking to us. Like you, I have a mother who turned 97 last week, and she, survived serious illness over the past winter, and we're very grateful that, against the rules, she's still alive today. Shows the power of the eternal. But we know that, she can die at any time, and she's been very good about telling us what her wishes are. And I think a lot of that conversation with her has already been had. My issue is going to be a sibling issue. I know that when the time comes, my brother and his wife are going to say, we're terrified of coronavirus. Because of coronavirus, we're going to have an outdoor cemetery funeral with very few people. Because of coronavirus, do I need to agree with that if I don't feel that way?
You want to? I'm happy to respond. I think what I would say, and it could be about coronavirus, it could be about a whole lot of other things where families see things differently. Sometimes I'll spend time talking with families where there's these divisions, where we try and find a way for everybody to get a little bit of what they need. So sometimes it happens where there's, like, where's Shiva going to be? It's like as if Shiva can only be in one place. It's like, well, Shiva could be one night here and one night here, or one night all together and one night in two different places. So sometimes it's about trying to figure out, because, if there's a perfect compromise, great. But either a lot of people or a little number of people. There's not really a middle ground there. So then the question is, how do you go about figuring out, look, saving life is the most important thing in Judaism. Whether we're in a stage where, being outside with a lot of people is really a risk, is something for doctors to say, not this kind of doctor, but other kinds of doctors to say. I don't know, do you have a response to that? Certainly coronavirus has been a challenge in all kinds of ways for families.
Yeah, for sure. And again, these are conversations that are challenging. And I was actually going to say, I think perhaps a doctor should chime in on this,
My brother's wife is a physician.
Oh, okay.
She's terrified that if she gets coronavirus, she won't be able to practice, and that'll be devastating. That's affected all aspects of our relationship since the pandemic started.
Challenging.
Yeah, for sure.
Challenging.
It's real hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Let's get a couple of words over here. We have just 5 more minutes. Oh, Joanne, yes. Thank you for helping me remember.
I just want to say that many years ago I came back from a funeral that had been chaotic. And I turned to my parents and I said at that point, "You're getting your plots now." And we picked out the plots and I said, "Okay, this is it now. Just sign the check, I'll mail it." And so they had their plots way in advance. Kendra Kipnis did a beautiful job at my mom's graveside ceremony. My aunt, there were just 5 people involved. I did the funeral at the graveside. I took the rabbi's manual and And there was somebody from Beth David who was hovering in the background to make sure that I wasn't doing the wrong things, but I didn't. But yeah, my parents and I had this discussion a long time ago. I've had the discussion with my nephews. I mean, I'm pre-planned at Plaza. And I think it's really important, I really do believe it's important to have the discussion while you're still sane and not in the throes of total despair.
Thank you so much. Carol, and then maybe one last hand. So two, Carol and then Michelle.
My question's from a different angle. This is from my angle for my funeral, not for my parents. They're gone. I have a big birthday coming, and it has come to my attention that this is something I need to take care of. And I'm talking about where I'm single, and so where should I be buried? And I need to get my sons and daughter-in-laws, and I guess my grandchildren, maybe, I don't know. But my daughter-in-laws don't get along. And to get them together would be very difficult. I mean, I can't even get them together to have a party for my birthday. So I am thinking about making my own arrangements and then writing them a letter, each of them separately, to my sons, telling them, these are my plans. How does that sound?
That sounds great. That sounds great. Unfortunately, it's a difficult situation, yet, and there you go, and they're not local. You know, when I talk about pre-planning, and I thank you for bringing that up, I talk about why should we pre-plan a funeral? And the number one reason we should think about pre-planning a funeral, we get to decide what we want. Well, that's a concept, right? Nobody should decide for me. I make decisions every single day of my life, and this one, I'm not going to have control over. So I think that you are doing exactly what we need to be doing, which is taking control and thinking about what I want. They'll be okay with whatever you decide.
And look, in an ideal world, of course, all the kids would get together and get along. But apparently families are complicated, not just yours.
Really? Really?
So I think, for sure. Okay, Michelle, you get the last word.
I'd like to hear some experience you've had with how people have creatively done a burial and a cremation between a couple and how that has been navigated. So if one of us wants one and the other wants the other.
That happens more often than you would think. There are some cemeteries that allow for the burial of cremains, if in fact that's a wish that the deceased has. There are families that have this conversation, and I'm very familiar with them in terms of, I definitely want to be buried, and my partner, that's not us, but my partner definitely wants to be cremated. Those wishes are known to their kids, and the kids have said, I don't agree with what you're doing, but I will honor your wishes. And how wonderful it is that the conversation is happening before somebody dies. And it doesn't become a he said, she said, in that moment especially.
So we are at time. In my sermon, I posed these questions as homework, and I offered to do the homework with you. And by that I mean I'm happy for us to continue this conversation. I hope and I imagine that Stephanie would be willing to come back and help us continue these conversations, because they're hard, they're not easy, they're uncomfortable, they're different. Different family dynamics are different. So whether that's individually or as a group, we want to be able to be supportive to you. I'm glad that today has sparked conversations for some of you. And please don't feel like you have to have this conversation alone. Yes, you have a quick question, Carol? Yeah. So Carol asked if I could put the 5 questions that I posed out for the congregation, and we will definitely do that. Absolutely. I was already thinking about pulling that out of the sermon and putting that in, inviting people to continue the conversation. Can we thank Stephanie for her time and her wisdom?
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And check out Exit Strategy wherever you find your podcasts. And there is an episode coming out with me next week, I think is right. And we'll put that out in the weekly as well. Thank you all for being here. And we're going to start our afternoon service in just about 10 minutes.
Shana
Thank you.
Tova.
Shana
Thank you.
Tova.